नमो नमः अष्टविनायक नमो नमः गणपति बाप्पा मोरया. Okay. Welcome to Keelan Yoga Podcast. Another solo episode today, so tune in or tune out as you wish. Today's episode is entitled Line in the Sand. People often ask me, what makes this yoga? Why am I doing yoga as opposed to just stretching, or what makes modern yoga yoga? Those kind of questions are the questions I love, as you know. Why can't anything be our yoga? There's another one that often comes up. Why can't I do a posture in this way? Why can't I just embrace my body in any way I feel? In some ways, you can. I agree. But what does make yoga yoga in the first place? So we'll just take a little whistle-stop tour through this simple question and my perspective on it. And you can obviously take it or leave it. I'm very diplomatic in this case. So just suggestions and possibilities in terms of how we might approach yoga. And nothing hard and fast. And as you know, to that end, I'm not a scholar, so don't take my word as gospel. Just thought-provoking ideas, really, which is what I like to do. Why can't anything be our yoga? What makes yoga in the first place? So my line in the sand is anything that affects the mind. Anything that affects the mind for consciousness, for developing our consciousness, could be yoga, right? And that could be a physical practice, a mental practice, meditation, chanting, any kind of practice where we're trying to do something other than simply the thing itself. We're trying to affect deep and lasting, not just changes in our consciousness, because of course we could do it with drugs or anything like that, but deep and lasting changes in our consciousness for the better, right? And that's not just changes in our consciousness, because again, we could affect our consciousness in all different ways to change it, but changes in our consciousness whereby we can see more, in the belief that we can do something to see more clearly the nature of reality. Of course, we could affect changes in our consciousness to simply control others. In fact, to be honest, I mean, changes in our consciousness to gain power over the mind and power over others has also been traditionally a subject of yoga. But in this case, we're going to say changes in our mind to affect the way that we see life more clearly, more positively, more satisfactorily for ourselves. Right? So changes in our mind. And in that case, classical yoga does this by stability. It's basically by trying to steady the mind, stop the mind. So once you withdraw the senses from their contact with their sense objects, then the mind reside in its own power of seeing. Sounds like a quote, a direct quote. It kind of almost is a direct quote, I think, from Patanjali. I read the stuff so much. Although you'll probably tell me which sutra it comes from. So classical yoga, and I try to steady the mind to stop it, and in which case it abides in its own power of seeing rather than being obsessed, or not obsessed, well, actually stuck. They say attachment is stuckness. Not obsessed, but preoccupied or distracted by the world outside. When you have no longer the distraction of the body or the distraction of the senses and emotions, then the mind comes to rest in its own power of lighting, basically the mind being envisaged like a projector, a film projector on a screen, and lighting up whenever it sees. And so generally you see the image, but if you don't see any image anymore, then the beam of light, the mind's projector, beams back on itself and illuminates that self behind it. This is, in the end of the day, let's say in inverted commas, a Hindu perspective, because of course the Buddhist perspective would say there's no sense of self to see. But the Indian perspective would say that, well, not the Indian, because Buddhism comes out of India as well. But the Hindu perspective, I'd say the yogic perspective would say that there's a self to find. There's an essential abiding self that's there behind the distractions. Anyway, we get distracted from ourselves here. From the main point, a line in the sand, what makes it yoga? So first of all, something that is an attempt to affect a positive change in the consciousness so we see life more clearly, more satisfactorily, as it is, you could say, rather than what we do a lot of the time, which is try to hide from our consciousness, try not to see, try to in any way overstimulate ourselves so we're distracted from ourselves by distraction, as T.S. Eliot said, or understimulate ourselves, basically turn off, tune in, drop out, watch Netflix, binge on Netflix. Not to say watching Netflix is bad, but maybe binging turns off the mind a little, or drinking or alcohol or copious sex, all these things allow us to kind of turn off. So we're trying to dumb our consciousness down, and because the weight of consciousness, if you hadn't noticed, the weight of consciousness is quite intense. It's the responsibility of being conscious all the time is quite a burden, right? So we're trying to escape that, yeah. But yoga does the opposite. It tries to embrace the consciousness and rectify the problem of consciousness, which is that we don't actually see enough. It's not that the problem is not consciousness itself. It's the problem is that we're not actually conscious enough. Anyway, so classical yoga does that through stopping the distraction of the outside world that stops us seeing ourselves more clearly, because when we see ourselves more clearly, we're happy with what we see, right? The self is always an adequate experience for the self, right? When you rest in yourself, as it said in the Bhagavad Gita, when you rest in yourself and are contented with the self, then you'll be happy, basically, right? It's a completely satisfactory experience, right? So that's classical yoga, but Hatha yoga comes from the tantric texts, and they come along later from around the 8th century. And the tantric texts do something different. Yeah? Well, not all tantric texts, but the ones on Hatha yoga, yeah, are suggesting a physical practice, which is really, I think, where we more end up today, because the classical yoga, if we do classical yoga, is not just about asanas, but classical yoga I described before, which is basically steadiness, stillness, stopping, or to do with cessation. Yeah. That kind of yoga probably involves one or two asanas, like Patanjali. How many asanas has he got in his commentary in the Yoga Sutras? About 5, and they're all sedentary, they're all sitting, they're all easy, just meditation positions. An as is a seat in that case, as the traditional translation of asana is. But in Hatha yoga, the asana isn't just a seat, really. It's quite challenging. The asanas start to become increasingly challenging. They're involving bandha, and engagement of the certain muscle groups, right? And this is kind of, I would say, the precedent or the antecedent of what we're doing today. But it's really because we're not using one or two asanas just to meditate. We are using the physical body to affect a change in consciousness. In which case, we're probably doing that yoga of force, ha, sa, the yoga of ha, yoga of force. Yeah, forceful yoga, something to do with the physical body. It was always said that Hatha yoga is a blunt object. Once you tried everything else, once you tried all the more intelligent types of yoga, if nothing else had worked, you do something to affect the body to change the state of the mind. So, change the state of the mind. How do you do that? Through the physical postures. Well, if you hadn't noticed, what makes yoga specific, that we're doing today as a physical practice, is all this use of the spine. No other physical modality is twisting the spine, bending forward, bending back, all this, every single posture, and all the lotus stuff as well. Right? Nothing else uses all this dexterous spinal movement in every single posture, as well as all this lotus stuff, which is at the end of the day about the sacrum, about the bottom of the spine, yeah, and the energy there, because it's most easy to stimulate that area at the bottom of the spine. It's most easy to stimulate that through the sacral joint, through using your legs, through your hips. So that immediately suggests something here in what we're doing, right? If we're doing Hatha yoga and many postures, then we're using the spine to stimulate the brain, right? And if we look at the postures themselves and say, well, what makes yoga yoga? Well, it's the strangeness of the postures, basically, isn't it? Is that they're weird, right? Why are we doing all these really strange stretches? Yep. Western stretching, which we encounter before yoga comes over, calisthenics, it's nothing like that. We don't have lotus. We don't have all such dexterous spinal movements, all the twists, every single posture involving us in these strange and fluid movements of the spine. And why? There must be a reason for it. So if we look practically and straightforwardly at this movement modality that we're doing, the line in the sand is spinal stimulation. What you're trying to do is affect stimulation of the spine. And why? Because the stimulation of the spine affects the mind. Okay. And why does it do that? Well, this is where it becomes more conjecture and hypothesis. And it's not just mine, but it's not guaranteed. The idea is that in stimulating the spine, you affect the nerves of the spine. And affecting the nerves of the spine, you create a little, let's say, break in the dialogue between the spine and the mind. And otherwise, you see, the mind and the body are talking to each other all the time through the spine and the nerves of the spine. So the experience the body's having is conveyed to the mind that makes sense of it. And what's attempting to be done in this loop, this constant feedback loop, body's getting sensation, mind is interpreting it, and maybe feeding it back to the body for action. What's being done all the time in that feedback loop is the attempt at homeostasis, right? The attempt at regulating our psychophysical experience, because the body is a heat-seeking mechanism for trying to stay the same. That's all the body knows. The body is only essentially a mechanism at the end of the day, and all it really can try to do is keep everything the same. Right? It's too complicated. It doesn't know anything else, right? It's just a mechanical thing in the end, right? And so that body will try and do that. And so with this constant processing of sensory experiences that come through the body to the mind and maybe back to the body again, the mind and body loop is just trying to regulate consciousness to stay the same. And in which case, we're kind of stuck because constantly getting this feedback loop, we can't break out of it, right? The mind is processing the experiences from the senses in the same way, even if they're not the same. It tries to get the same experience. It tries to get the same basic information out of them. So by the time you reach quite a young age, you're trapped in this feedback loop of mind-body homeostasis. And what yoga does, because we could go further there, but what yoga does is it breaks that feedback loop, right? By stimulating the spine, you create a little break in this dialogue between spine and mind. And creating a little break in this dialogue, you're free potentially to reassess. Otherwise, the spine will relay the information. The synaptic loops in the brain have become so wired together. As I say, neurons that fire together are wired together. You've got little rat runs, you've got little paths in the brain. And those paths in the brain we could call vasanas or grooves, like they say in Indian terminology. The samskaras are a group of grooves. And so you run down certain grooves, you get a certain experience from the body, and the mind makes sense of it along the grooves that it knows best, in the ways that it already is familiar with. It's not going to make a new groove up very easily, yeah, unless that experience happens again and again. It makes sense of the experiences that you're having, even if they're new experiences, through the old grooves, because those grooves are wired together very hard in the mind. Yeah. So the neurosynaptic pathways are very, very deeply entrenched. Right? But if you stimulate the spine, you create a little blockage from this dialogue, and there's the possibility to look again and to basically rewire your brain. All you're doing is you're, in a certain sense, lightly overwhelming the brain briefly. So it doesn't flow so quickly through its neurosynaptic rat runs, and you get this opportunity to create new ones, to create new vasanas, to create new pathways, yeah, through the stimulation of the spine. The problem is that you might overstimulate the spine. It's all too easy to create too much stimulation in the spine, right? To overwhelm the spine through stretching too hard, through pushing too hard, and then the mind is completely overwhelmed. It can't do anything, right? So it's all about the dose in the end. Of course, it could also be about underdosing. You may not affect stimulation through the spine at all if you're just stretching out of yourself. So the line in the sand, to come back to the podcast title, what makes yoga yoga? Why can't we call anything our yoga? Well, in modern yoga, I would say it's about stimulating the spine. And secondly, that has to be done through right tension, yeah, through creating a pressure inwardly on the body. So now we're talking about a stretch which is pulling together, or an isometric stretch, a stretch that creates inward pressure on the body rather than stretching out of yourself, like to stretch a hamstring, just to push forward. That would be an isotonic stretch, or just a passive stretch, to stretch a thing, to stretch a ligament or muscle fascia or a muscle of the body, just in a sense of one way only, one direction only. Yeah, to stretch a limb, that would be a passive stretch. A stretch that I would say is a stretch and not a yoga stretch. But a yoga stretch is to do with pressurizing the spine. Yeah, that's why we have the word tapas in the first place, heating. And heating is just a synonym for pressure, really. It's a metaphor in my mind for this need to create internal pressure through the spine. We use the word tapas to heat. So you're heating the vessel. Often the body is described as a pot to create pressure inside. Yep. And the pot is basically space. The body's made up of space, and inside that space, the rod of the spine runs. So you're trying to pressurize that pot to stimulate the spine. And that's through right tension. And in a practical sense, that right tension means whenever there's a push out of yourself, there's a pull back towards yourself. And in which case you have this engagement of pressure coming towards yourself. But as I said, you can avoid that through basically stretching in one direction only, like through doing a passive stretch, or you can also avoid that through overstretching, through overstimulating the spine, through pushing yourself too hard. And in which case, what happens there is you involve yourself in a mental overwhelm. Right? So you're no longer stimulating the spine to the right degree where you kind of affect a little break for the mind and body to reassess their experience, and change. What's happening instead is you're completely overwhelming the mind. It's like taking a drug, right? For example, you take a drug, right? And if you take the right dose, many drugs, they don't create any particular experience. What they do is they deregulate your perception of reality. So, to that end, you have an opportunity to use the drug to look again. And that's why most drugs are perceived as enjoyable, right? Because what they allow is a break out of normal reality, a break to look again afresh and have different experiences in the mind. And it's very exciting for us because we're so bored with our own homeostasis, with our own looking out the same every day, Groundhog Day. A drug that unsettles that is perceived as exciting, but it has quite a neutral tone in the end. It's not color. Most drugs don't have a color or form. They just give you the opportunity to, depending on what's inside you already, um, to manifest something different. Yeah. Similarly, with the spine, if you do it in the right dosage, right, it gives you the opportunity to look again. But like any drug, if you take an overdose, if you take a greater dose than you should, overdose, you could overdose in your yoga. But if you take a greater dose than you should, then what happens is you're just capsized by the drug. Yeah, it just overwhelms you, and you can't do anything with it. Yeah, it's the same with yoga. If you're pushing hard, if you're overstimulating your nervous system, then what happens is that you become addicted to the drug of yoga. You're addicted to simply stimulating. Yeah, you're addicted simply to being overwhelmed, and in the overwhelming experience, weirdly, tuning out of life. Right? It gives you a break. Yoga um, is so attractive to many of us, and me included for many years, because it gives you a break from the mind. Yeah, because you're overstimulating the body, so the mind shuts down because it's numbed, it's completely numb. So, like a drug, it gives you that time out of mind for a brief period, and it's very enjoyable because it takes the pressure off. Not to say that's never a bad use of yoga, because sometimes we just do need that time. But if you use the right dosage of the stretch, then you're creating this gently unsettling the feedback loop between mind and body. And when you do that, you've got this chance to rewire your brain. And it's very much in the precedent of Kundalini, really, but just like a Kundalini light. Whereas the original Kundalini is to do with energizing the central channel, Sushumna Nadi. What I'm suggesting in this modern iteration of the same Hatha Yoga principle is that we are energizing the central channel. We're just not trying to raise the Kundalini anymore. Yeah? And I do believe that it was a, a bona fide experience that people had raising the Kundalini. I just don't think that that's appropriate for us right now, unless we're doing yoga 24/7 under very strict guidance and have left the world. Because Kundalini, for most people, if it's raised, and if you look at people that have had this experience of Kundalini awakening, it's very difficult to live a normal life in the world. Yeah, so I think that we're much more helpful to us would be to simply have this idea of stimulating the spine without stimulating it to the degree that it's completely overwhelmed. And like the Kundalini, is stimulating to the degree of blowing the system. We're not trying to blow our system. We're just trying to tinker with it, to make small changes, to affect our consciousness in a more free and open way to look again at the world and make new decisions based on new information and not past conditioning, not past decisions, which is very tedious to always live in the past, which is karma, of course, the tedium of being controlled by the past and never allowed to look fresh in the present. So Hatha Yoga approaches the same problem that all yoga approaches in the end, which is the problem of karma, controlling us from the past, and how do we break from karma, which doesn't allow us to see clearly. Because, like I said at the start, if you see clearly your mind, then if you'll come into yourself and are with yourself, then it's completely satisfactory as an experience. But it's not satisfactory for us living generally, unless you're other than me, that if you don't see yourself clearly because you have past conditioning, all these grooves in the brain, all these synaptic grooves in the brain that aren't allowing you a free response to the present. Yeah, because these grooves are deep and all the information is just assimilated in the old grooves. So even if it's different information, you take it the same way and you react in the same way because you don't see the information clearly. Well, as I said, Hatha Yoga line in the sand is to create a light right tension in the spine to affect this little, let's say, deregulation of the mind body dialogue through the spine, and creating that little break allows us more space to look again, which is why we say in common parlance, when someone says, "Oh, why do you practice yoga?" And you might say, "Well, to be a better person, right? To be less reactive," will be your qualifier of that generally, right? To be less reactive, to be kinder, and all these things require a little space between action and reaction to take place, to be more aware. All these things require us to be less reactive. And allowing this deregulation, light one, of mind and body gives us the opportunity to look again. Yeah? But as I said, it's easy to overwhelm your nervous system by zoning out, by using yoga as a numbing. Yeah? And then you don't get that because the mind can't really look and analyze and make new decisions because it's completely overwhelmed. Or, of course, you could underuse your yoga. You could do very, very unchallenging practice, which is almost tamasic rather than rajasic. It could almost be just perhaps try to dumb down your mind and avoid consciousness again. Yeah. So it's again getting the dose right. Yeah. The final thing I didn't mention is the role of the breath here. What's the breath got to do with anything? And I think I'll do a separate podcast on this again soon because the breath is really outside the right tension of the spine. The breath is the ultimate way that you create pressure in your pot. If you imagine you've got external pressure and you've got internal pressure, if you've got a pot, it's got a pressure on the inside, right? And that's dependent on the pressure on the outside of the pot. Now, with the breath, what you can do is affect the pressure inside that pot, right? But that's to do with how you hold the diaphragm, yeah? And in turn, how you hold the diaphragm is to do with bandha. So bandha could be described as a right tension of the spine, pulling together. You need bandha for that. You need to have a kind of grip of your torso to pull together, and that requires a certain use of bandha. Not squeezing your abs. It's much more skillful than that. But again, if you like, I can go over the bandha as well, as it applies to physical stretching. But also using the breath also requires bandha because if you breathe in your stomach, so-called belly breathing, right, that would be used, I would say, for classical yoga. You're trying to calm the nervous system, so you're using belly breathing, yeah? And that's fairly easy. And that's using the diaphragm from. This is where it gets difficult. The diaphragm is a muscle. It's got two ends. Right? It's got its origin where it starts and its end where it ends its insertion. So if you'd use the diaphragm just normally, let's say, from its origin, yeah, then you'll feel like the belly is being pushed out as the diaphragm moves downwards. That's quite easy because you're using the muscle in its normal way that it will be used. And that calms the nervous system. Likely is that the vagus nerve is stimulated through that area of the abdomen. Yeah, you can stimulate its tone through there. And the vagus nerve is to do with nervous system regulation. What people say, getting into the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, if you use the diaphragm from its other end, the its insertion where it attaches to the ribs, you can only do that if you stabilize, if you hold its origin, yeah, where it attaches, where it doesn't attach. There's a cord, and it's in the middle, right below the sternum. Yeah. So if you hold the diaphragm from the middle, you can breathe into your rib cage, so-called bellows breathing, yeah, breathing the ribs laterally. But that's difficult, and it doesn't happen naturally. So you have to use bandha to do that, to hold the diaphragm from its origin, to move it from its insertion. And that'll take the breath into the upper chest. And when you take the breath into the upper chest, that's when you stimulate the pressure in the spine most fundamentally, yeah, because that's where the spine is most contacted, yeah, through the upper chest, not the belly. Yeah. And that's yoga breathing. Yeah. It's more difficult and it involves bandha. And that's creating pressure on the spine through the right use of the diaphragm. So that's also, so it's right tension, if we're talking about the line in the sand, to go back to our title, because I know it gets complicated. Right tension on the spine through a way of stretching that involves us pulling towards ourselves, not just stretching out of ourselves, not just stretching into an arm or into a leg, but pulling together. And secondly, a right use of the breathing. That means thoracic breathing, upper chest breathing, using the diaphragm in the right way, i.e., using bandha to hold its origin and move from the insertion, which again, I could do another podcast on if you like and if you comment. And that is the line in the sand of why anything can't be our yoga. Of course, anything in classical terms, perhaps anything could be more our yoga in terms of gardening or piano or running or climbing being our yoga if we're trying to concentrate the mind. But in another sense, that would be a long way around and a difficult way to concentrate the mind because classical yoga is always talking about stasis, stopping, cessation, stabilizing ourselves, being quiet and still enough that we really come back to ourselves. And if we're distracted by a particular task, yeah, then that will make stability very difficult, right? So in that case, probably anything couldn't be our yoga, even if we're talking about classical yoga. But if we're talking about Hatha yoga, what I suggest we're doing in the modern context, then we must really talk about something that stimulates the spine to the degree that affects changes in consciousness. And that really nothing else does that but these weird and strange yoga stretches that we're doing. They're all to do with the lotus, stimulating the sacral region, and to do with every stretch is a twist or a turn or an up or a down, a flexion or extension of the spine. No other physical modality does that. So to that end, no, not everything can be our yoga. And there's also a certain way to do the stretches to affect right tension on the body. And then you have, again, a line in the sand of how we stretch in our asanas. It's not just anymore, well, I like to do the posture this way, but if you're doing Hatha yoga, well, the posture has to be done. And not to say that there's a particular way for each individual that it's not going to show up, but the posture has to be done within the certain framework where you affect right tension on the spine. Doesn't mean that the foot should definitely be always in this position, or you should always take the toe in Trikonasana, for example, yeah, or you should always catch this or that. No, you should always bind in Marichasana. No, it just means that there's a certain framework where you have attention pulling together. How that manifests for the individual will be particular to the capacities of the individual body. Yep. But nevertheless, there is a line in the sand. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that podcast, and I'll be back next week with another guest, Simon Borg Olivier, one of my favorite yoga teachers to talk to. So, hope you're having a great week. You had a great week, and I'll see you again next week. Thanks for listening to me. Bye for now.
नमो नमः श्री सिद्धि विनायक नमो नमः